Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about my favourite pieces in the world of Haute Horology, or High Horology. But I'd just like to say first of all I've got a bit of a sore throat at the moment, so I do apologise for my voice sounding a little bit crackly today. But I hope you can just bear with me on today's occasion. Now the first watch which I'd like to talk about is the Breguet Classique Chronométrie 7277. And this is a very interesting watch because I think it's one of the few watches in Haute Horology where the watch is designed and produced with a very real function, because often a number of high horology pieces are produced with complications which add to the aesthetic appeal and the complication of the watch, but without really, on a day-to-day basis, giving the watch any greater functionality. Now this watch comes in either a steel or a gold version. For the steel version is around the £25,000 to £30,000 mark, which, considering the complication of this watch and the brand, I don't think this watch is actually particularly bad value compared to other offerings from other brands. This is because this watch is pretty unique in its functionality, because it operates at 10 Hz, so that's 72,000 beats per hour. Which is twice that of usual high beat movements, which beats around 36,000, or for most 4 Hz movements, 28,800. And this does show that Breguet really is producing a watch which I think is the first watch which is purely mechanical, which does give a pure sweep to the second hand. Well, having seen one of these watches, the individual ticks are barely visible, if at all visible. This is further emphasised by the fact that it has a 2-second counter just by the seconds at 12 o'clock, which turns at a fantastic rate, really, but does serve to illustrate the smoothness of the ticking of this watch due to its high beat count. This 45 dual movement is also notable due to the way that it suspends its cogs. So several of the parts of this movement, notably the balance wheel, are supported in by a magnetic field. So this allows them to right themselves if the watch is dropped. Now I find this technology particularly noteworthy because it means that whereas most anti-shock systems are dependent upon several cogs and their bearings not moving as a result of being strengthened, but even they are susceptible to eventually being damaged by a shock, whereas here the balance wheel can actually move off its axes but then will be returned to them to keep time perfectly by those magnetic fields. Of course, the case, dial and movement finishes are of course the typical tour de force which one can expect from Breguet, with an incredible number of different finishes on the dial, with guilloching and various other patterns produced to give a very complex look. On this silver dial, those blued Breguet-style hands are also extremely legible, considering the fact that they aren't loomed and are fairly narrow, but that colour contrast really does form a high legibility on this watch. That's also helped by the low-profile bezel around this dial, meaning that the vast majority of the front of this watch is dial, drawing the eye to that fantastic movement and its functions. Equally, the case is quite simple, but has these beautiful strakes on the sides in a vertical orientation to give a refined look, but still have a fully polished case, with that very classic appeal of a Breguet. Of course, another interesting thing about this watch is the fact that it's still able to have a 60-hour power reserve as a manually wound watch, despite having such a high beat count rate. So it's using a great deal more energy due to the way this movement functions, yet it's still able to have a very long power reserve. Obviously not in the realms of some watches which can last 8 days, for example, but it's still impressive that this watch is able to hold a 60-hour power reserve. Of course, one has the 60-hour power reserve indicator to allow one to tell where one is and whether one needs to wind the watch or not. Now the next watch on this list is the Jaeger-LeCoultre Gyro Tourbillon, and this truly is an incredible movement. Now it's come in various forms over the years, but it certainly is an incredible piece in any of its iterations. Now it's come in a circular watch format, but equally in the classic reverso twice, or at least twice in the most well-known models. So there was a very large 55 by 36mm version, which was a 16mm deep watch, which in my opinion was too large. But then they did release a smaller version, which is only 51 by 24, I believe, and much thinner, I believe 12.5mm. and this really did show how Jaeger-LeCoultre is still developing this technology, and it really is a progressing piece of technology, which is something I appreciate when a lot of tourbillons have remained the same for a very, very long time. Now, the tourbillon itself is a double-axis tourbillon, so it turns on one axis in a clockwise fashion and takes 60 seconds to do that, and then turns on a second axis at a different rate. Now, depending on the model, some take 18, some take about 12 seconds to do this rotation, but either way, it's an incredible spectacle to see. Now, one interesting point about this particular type of tourbillon is that the cage which surrounds the tourbillon itself, that ball in the base of the movement here, as you can see, which rotates on those two axes, is actually made from a single piece of aviation-grade aluminium. And this is due to the fact that it had to be extremely light to function correctly, and making it up out of several pieces wasn't an option because screws or joints would add too much weight and would imbalance the mechanism, thus damaging timekeeping. Now, if one disregards the tourbillon for a minute, the rest of the movements that these tourbillons have to be produced with in order to function correctly are really incredible in terms of engineering that's gone into them in order to be able to use that tourbillon correctly. And in order to have enough cogs and levels to function with that tourbillon, the different bridges actually have to be placed less than a millimetre above or below each other to be able to function with that tourbillon, which I think is truly incredible. And this watch operates within tolerances that one rarely sees in the industry. Now, the reason why I like this movement so much, and I've put it into this video because I suppose technically it isn't a watch, but rather a mechanism. But I love the way this movement functions, and by comparison to other tourbillons, I love it because it's a very different take on the traditional technology which one has seen for many years. And whereas a lot of brands can produce tourbillons, very few can produce a tourbillon which really sets itself apart from other brands, like the gyro tourbillon has. Now, of course, this watch does come at great expense. For example, for the most recent version of the Reverso with this movement, I believe the price is $270,000, which is, of course, an enormous amount of money for a watch. But it certainly does show that Jaeger-LeCoultre is really differentiating itself in terms of this technology. Now, the next line of watches I'd like to talk about is the Cartier Mystère, or mystery, types of watches. And these have been primarily based on their rotonde design of wristwatch, and various watches have been made with this system, and I love the fact that they've produced watches where they can have, for example, floating hands on two planes of glass, or, for example, a floating tourbillon with no, obvious connection to the rest of the watch, which I think is a very interesting design and one which I appreciate a great deal. Of course, the design of the rotonde is fairly simple. It's a rounded watch with some drop-down lugs, and a decreasing diameter to the watch as one looks at the side of the wristwatch. It's difficult to describe, but certainly a very beautiful, elegant, and very classic design. These do also have those wonderful cabochon-style crowns with the jewel in the top of the crown, and with those simple grips to the crown, which are semi-spheres, which allow good grip on the crown, but equally allow the watch to have that very 1920s and quite lustrous look, without actually having any diamonds or gems on the dial. However, the version of this watch which I find particularly interesting is the mystery version, and several versions of this watch have been made over the years, and these have a system by which several panes of glass are used to sandwich mechanism parts or hands to produce a very interesting illusion, which is that the hands, or the double tourbillon in the case of the one which you see on the screen now, doesn't appear to be connected to any other part of the watch, which leads to a view of these parts which is unparalleled, really, when you have them attached to something. Of course, one can't ignore the technology which has been put into these watches with regards to the complications shown by this mystery design. So one has movement components like double tourbillons, which are again very rare, not as rare as the gyro tourbillon which I just showed you, but nonetheless rare and interesting pieces, which are further demonstrated, of course, by this greater visibility which this design yields. Equally, what I find interesting about this design is that with this concept, Cartier has moved away from the usual approach, I suppose, to high horology, which is to try and make a watch as complicated as it can be. But in this case, Cartier have actually worked to make a watch which looks extremely simple, and this is designed to make a watch as simple as it can possibly look, which is a very interesting endeavour, an interesting concept when, of course, as I've said, other brands tend to look to make a watch look as complex as it can be, whereas here the complexity is in the simplicity. Equally, I find Cartier's design in general very refreshing, in that they take a very minimalistic approach, sometimes spectacularly so, to making their watches as classically correct as possible, yet with a strange level of nostalgia to the 1920s and 30s, which clearly have spawned the designs of many of these watches. The next watch on this list is an individual watch, and this is the MB&F Legacy Machine 1. And this is a watch which has fascinated me since I first saw it, and it's from a brand which I absolutely love. Now, of course, due to the name of this watch, hence the name, this watch is the first of the Legacy machines in their lineup. And this is a particularly interesting watch due to its dial layout, for example, which has, of course, those two time zones that you can set two individual clock faces, with that floating balance wheel sitting between them. Now, this is a beautiful watch in that one can really appreciate the mechanism of this watch due to that flying balance wheel, because one often sees open heart watches or semi-skeleton watches, but here one actually sees that section of the movement placed above the dial, and shows the dial is actually placed within the movement, which is quite an interesting touch. Now, the case finishing is also very interesting. Now, it's primarily brushed, which does give a somewhat sporty appeal to this watch, despite being a very classically inspired timepiece. Now, I think this is very, very indicative of the way that MB&F have gone, and as a fairly young brand, MB&F certainly have made a serious mark, and I had the pleasure to try one of these watches on, have a look at one, in London a few weeks ago, and certainly it did leave its mark on me. Of course, it's rare to see a watch where actually this watch actually has three dials. So it has the base dial, which is that radially brushed finish, which depending on the model comes in a grey, a green, a blue, and various other colours depending on which one you pick in terms of case metal. Of course, the case metals of these watches are available really in everything you can think of, apart from perhaps silver, from titanium to steel to red gold and platinum. So really there's an enormous number of different versions of this watch, depending on the individual's taste. Apart from the large base dial, the individual dials are finished in a very nice porcelain style, and then are framed wonderfully with that highly domed sapphire crystal, which is a very interesting shape and isn't the usual double-domed shape which one would normally get, but rather a much smoother dome, still extremely high, but much smoother. What I most like about MB&F, though, is the way that they manage to produce watches which look both very, very classic, but equally very modern in their style, even futuristic in some cases. Now, personally, I prefer rounded watches like these ones, but of course they do produce a great deal of watches which truly are incredible in terms of their designs. But nonetheless, I do enjoy the sort of pseudo-futuristic nature of their watches combined with classic watchmaking. Now, the final watch on this list shan't come as much of a surprise, because it truly is an incredible piece, and I think is the most complicated wristwatch in the world. Not the most complicated watch, because there was a limited edition Vacheron Constantin which beat this, but nonetheless, I think this wristwatch, the Grandmaster Chime from Patek-Philippe, truly is an incredible piece of engineering. So this is, of course, the very famous double-sided Patek-Philippe wristwatch, produced to mark the 175th anniversary of the brand. Now, if this is what they make for 175th anniversary, then I can't imagine what they're going to make for their 200th. So the case of this watch is entirely engraved gold, and there is a video on YouTube which shows how the watch is made, which is quite incredible, and I would advise anyone to go and watch it, if you have the time. And it's entirely hand-engraved, down to those very leaves around the bezel, which truly is a feat of craftsmanship and skill. Now, the movement inside this watch is also no less than a marvel. It's a manually wound 72-hour power reserve movement, which is quite a large movement, but does have an incredible number of complications, notably a minute repeater, grande et petite sonnerie, a moon phase, and a perpetual calendar with the year, which I think is quite an incredible feat to all fit into one watch. And that's excluding various other complications which are seen on this. Now, I do think that in terms of mechanisms and complications, this watch truly is the pinnacle of Swiss watchmaking. It shows craftsmanship that I've never seen elsewhere. The level of case finishing is unbelievable on this watch, as I've said, and equally the fact that this watch is double-sided, so the watch actually pivots on its lugs to enable one to see all the other complications on the second dial. Now, the second dial is slightly less spectacular, with 4 sub-dials, without quite the amount of gold which is seen on the primary dial, but nonetheless is incredible, and I can understand why this was done in order to allow there to be space to place these complications rather than having them on top of each other. Another incredible fact demonstrated by this watch was the use of 6 new patents for Patek-Philippe in this watch, which of course, hence the patents. They're new inventions which have been copyrighted. And it's incredible, really, to see a watch which has this many new technologies in it, which haven't been seen before. Because, of course, this watch is already incredible as simply a compilation, if you will, of all the greatest and most advanced technologies which one can see in a highly complicated watch. But to see new technologies really is incredible. Of course, these watches are being made in extremely small numbers, and small numbers being 6. 6 examples of this watch, which were all sold last year, I believe. And truly are incredible pieces, but I must say the price of this watch truly is, and I don't like to use this term, but it truly is vulgar and unethical, frankly, in my opinion. And it's only my opinion, really, to spend such a large amount of large sum on a watch, which in this case is $2.6 million. And I do understand that an enormous amount of craftsmanship has gone into these watches, but nonetheless, I personally would never spend that much money on a watch. Anyway, I'll end here. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you did enjoy this video. And if there are some really interesting high horology watches which you think my attention should be pointed towards, then please do include them in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching. Do please like, share and subscribe if you did enjoy this video and would like to see more videos on my channel. Thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.